Linda, did our baby get born while I was on my trip? Steve's tone was infuriatingly nonchalant. Yes, the baby was born, I replied, my voice steady but heart-pounding. I want to speak to my wife directly, he insisted. Your wife, Emily, has passed away. What? You're kidding, right? Come to the funeral now. Ignoring his stunned silence, I added under my breath, all of this is your fault. You will pay for this, and hung up. With shaking hands, I placed the phone down. Emily's lifeless body lay before me. My sweet daughter, only 30, taken too soon. I leaned over her, stroking her cold forehead as memories of her final days flashed vividly in my mind. The guilt and anger burned through me. That fateful night had begun so normally. A mundane dinner followed by the usual phone call. Emily sounded exhausted. Her pregnancy had been rough. Steve's neglect didn't help. His trips were an excuse to avoid responsibility. Her voice was shaky. Mom, I don't feel good. The contractions, they're early. I dropped everything, fumbling for my keys. George wasn't home yet, stuck in a meeting. I cursed the traffic, my heart drumming against the steering wheel. By the time I reached Emily's house, she was barely conscious, the pain overwhelming her. We rushed to the hospital, my hands clenched around hers, whispering reassurances. I wasn't sure I believed myself. In those moments, Emily's strength, her grace, stood out. She brought her child into the world with determination, even as her health deteriorated rapidly. When she held her baby for the first time, her worried eyes spoke volumes about her fears, about Steve. Mom, she had whispered weakly, I need you to do something for me. What is it, sweetheart? Divorce papers. They're in the bottom drawer, under the old letters. I can't stay with him. Promise me, Mom. I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't let her down. The next few days were a blur of hospital beds and whispered prayers. As the baby slept in my arms, I noticed the bruises on Emily's body. They were faint but unmistakable. Steve's anger had marked her, his love twisted into something poison. The phone rang again, jolting me back to the present. It was George. Linda, how are you holding up? Not good, George. Not good at all. We need to bury Emily, and I want Steve to see what he's done. We'll get through this, he reassured me softly. Together. Hanging up, I wiped my tears, leaning closer to Emily. Your suffering won't be in vain. I promise. As I cradled the newborn, she stirred slightly. I held her tight, feeling Emily's strength within this tiny life. Steve and Susan would face the consequences. Emily's story wouldn't end in tragedy. It would be the beginning of justice. With steely resolve, I prepared for the coming storm. Mom, I'm scared. Emily's voice trembled through the phone. It was early afternoon, and she was alone in their empty house. She was due in 2 weeks, but her contractions had started. I gripped the steering wheel, navigating through the bumper-to-bumper traffic, my heart thudding. Hold on, baby girl. I'm almost there. Every minute felt like an hour. When I finally pulled into her driveway and raced to the front door, it was already slightly ajar. Inside, Emily lay on the couch, her face contorted in pain. Mom, she gasped, something's wrong? We're going to the hospital, Em. You just hang on. I helped her up, practically carrying her to the car. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Emily clutched my hand, her knuckles white, as I speeded through the streets. It's hurting so bad, she whimpered. Stay with me, Em, I urged, my voice shaking. We're almost there. The hospital doors slid open as I yelled for help. Nurses rushed forward, and Emily was quickly taken away on a stretcher. I sprinted after them, refusing to leave her side. Hours blurred into each other as doctors worked on Emily. The delivery was quick, almost urgent, as if the baby knew time was running out. Emily was exhausted but relieved when she finally held her tiny daughter. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, You're safe now. You're going to be okay. I stayed by Emily's side, holding her free hand tightly. Steve didn't come, and I didn't expect him to. His absence spoke volumes about his priorities, or lack thereof. Late into the night, Emily's breathing grew shallow. Mom, she whispered hoarsely. Steve, he's not going to change, is he? I shook my head, tears welling up. No, honey, he's not. Her eyes filled with sadness and determination. Promise me, Mom, keep her safe. File those papers. I promise, Em, I vowed, holding her hand even tighter. The moment Emily was stable enough, I rushed back to her house. Fumbling through the drawer she mentioned, I found the hidden divorce papers. A lump formed in my throat as I saw her signature, the scrawled hope for a future she desperately wanted but couldn't grasp. Returning to the hospital, I checked in on Emily, who lay quietly, her strength waning. Steve and his mother, Susan, were nowhere to be seen. Despite his cruelty, my heart ached for him to at least show some concern for Emily and their child. Hours turned into days, and Emily's condition worsened. Her once bright eyes dimmed, her smile faded. She held the baby weakly, whispering, "You're my light, my little fighter." "Emily," I said softly, holding back my tears, "we're here for you, always." Emily's grip loosened and her eyelids fluttered shut. An eerie calm fell over the room. She never woke up. As I sat there holding her lifeless hand, all I could think about was the promise I made and the revenge that would soon be set in motion. The fire within me grew. Steve and Susan would come, and they would see. As Emily's health declined rapidly, there was a frantic energy in the hospital room. Nurses came in and out, seldom making eye contact. They knew what was looming. Emily held her baby girl, tears falling as she whispered, "Mom, don't let her grow up without love." I squeezed her hand. "She'll have all the love in the world, Em. I promise." Emily's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. "What about Steve? What if he tries to take her?" "Don't worry about that now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll make sure she's safe." Steve finally walked into the room, his face twisted in irritation. "Is this what all the fuss is about?" he sneered. His eyes barely flicked to Emily before settling on the newborn. "I was in an important meeting." Emily's weak voice quivered. "Steve, this is your daughter." Yeah, he muttered dismissively. "I can't stay long. What do you need?" It took everything in me not to snap at him. "Just be here for her," I managed to say. Sure, Steve said, looking at his watch. "But don't expect me to babysit. I'm busy." A nurse walked in with some paperwork. "Mr. Johnson, we need your signature here." Steve scribbled his name without even reading. "Is that it?" Emily tried to speak, but her strength was fading. "Steve." "Listen, Emily," he interrupted. "Try not to make everything so dramatic. I'll sort things out when I get a chance." Without another word, he walked out. Emily's eyes followed him, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Mom, what if he takes her?" I leaned closer, brushing the hair from her forehead. "He won't. You rest now. I'll take care of everything." Emily's breathing was labored, her voice a mere whisper. "Promise me." "I promise," I said. Emily's eyes closed and she slipped into unconsciousness. Hours later, the beeping slowed, then stopped. The nurses came in and confirmed what I already knew. My daughter's fight was over. After Emily's death, the hospital staff handed me the baby. Holding my granddaughter felt like holding a piece of Emily. As I sat by Emily's bed, I noticed the bruises on her arms again. Proof of the life she endured with Steve. My grip on the hospital gown tightened. Steve had not only failed as a husband, he had also failed as a father, and he would pay for that. I left the hospital room, the baby cooing softly in her sleep. Determination fueled every step I took. I headed straight to the courthouse to file the divorce papers. Emily may be gone, but I wouldn't let Steve tarnish her memory or take away her daughter's future. The following day, I found Emily's hidden journal in her room. As I read her accounts of Steve's neglect and abuse, my anger solidified. Steve's time of reckoning was near, and I'd make sure he felt every ounce of the pain he had inflicted on Emily. Justice for Emily would come, starting at her funeral. The fire of my grief and anger burned hotter, fueling what needed to be done. Emily's funeral loomed, and the preparations were a haunting blur. I kept thinking back to the last thing she asked of me: keep her baby safe. As I combed through her belongings, I almost missed it. A small, leather-bound journal, hidden under some clothes. Opening it, I felt my stomach twist with each harrowing entry. Steve yelled again today because I forgot to buy his favorite cereal. The bruise on my arm hasn't faded yet, and now there's a new one. My hands trembled, rage bubbling under my skin. The entries detailed months of torment, emotional abuse, isolation, and indifference. Steve's calculated cruelty pushed Emily further into a corner, leaving her battered and broken. We were supposed to celebrate our anniversary. Instead, he went to his mother's house. Susan thinks I'm not good enough for him. She doesn't know half of what goes on here, or she doesn't care. Susan's name made my blood boil. She was complicit, if not in action, then in apathy. They were partners in Emily's misery. Emily wrote of Susan's dismissive smirks, her cold shoulder every time Emily sought help, and her blatant favoritism towards Steve. Grief morphed with fury as Emily's words painted a picture of a life entrapped by fear. Yet she never lost hope for her daughter's future. Over the next few days, I clung to that hope as I planned the funeral, determined to make it more than just a farewell. It would be a reckoning. Steve and his vile mother needed to know the gravitas of their actions. On the morning of the funeral, Susan arrived first, her expression a mix of false solemnity and underlying arrogance. "Linda," she said, nodding slightly, "such a tragedy, isn't it?" "More than you know, Susan," I replied coldly. Steve walked in moments later, his face set in an insincere mask of grief that didn't reach his eyes. He ignored the whispers around him, walking straight to me. "Linda, listen." He started. "No, you listen," I cut him off. "You and your mother need to hear what Emily endured. Sit down and shut up." His face contorted with a mix of anger and confusion, but he sat. The air was thick with tension as I stood, holding the journal. I opened to a page, my voice breaking only slightly. Emily wrote, "Mom, if anything happens to me, please take care of my little girl. Keep her away from Steve and Susan. They won't change." A murmur swept through the attendees. Steve's face flushed as Susan looked around nervously. He never cared for her, not in the way a husband should. Emily suffered because of his neglect and abuse, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I passed around the photos of Emily's bruises, taken secretly by her in moments of despair. Gasps filled the room, eyes widening in horror. "You will pay for what you've done," I said, staring directly at Steve. "Emily's death is on your hands, and justice will come." Steve tried to stand, his mouth opening to argue, but the weight of the evidence and the glares from the room pinned him down. He knew then, Emily's suffering would not go unanswered. My fight had just begun, and I wouldn't stop until Emily had her justice. At the funeral service, the atmosphere was thick with a mix of sorrow and anger. George stood beside me, his presence a pillar of strength. Our focus was on Emily's memory, but I couldn't ignore the burning desire for justice. Steve and Susan's arrival was like a dark cloud overshadowing the proceedings. They walked in as if they owned the place, their indifference palpable. Steve wore a smug smile that turned my stomach. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. As the service concluded, I took a deep breath and approached Steve and Susan. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Steve smirked. "Always something with you, Linda." Ignoring his sarcasm, I continued, "Emily left something for you both. It's important." I led them to a quiet corner of the room, away from the prying eyes of mourners. From my bag, I pulled out the divorce papers and slid them across the table towards Steve. His eyes widened in surprise. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Emily was filing for divorce," I said bluntly. "She had enough of your abuse." Susan scoffed. "Abuse? Don't be ridiculous. Emily was too sensitive." "Sensitivity had nothing to do with it," I snapped. "These papers were her lifeline, the only proof she had of her decision to leave you." Steve's face darkened. "You think you can blame me for her death?" "You didn't just contribute to her death," I whispered harshly. "You crafted the environment that led to it, and you'll face the consequences." Steve laughed derisively. "You think anyone will believe you?" I pulled out copies of Emily's journal entries and handed them to him. "These are Emily's truths. Bruises, neglect, emotional torment. I have everything documented." Susan paled, her confidence wavering. "This will ruin you, Steve," she whispered. "It's already too late," I said, my voice firm. "Emily also changed her life insurance policy. Your name is off it. The beneficiary is her daughter under my guardianship." Steve's face turned red. "You conniving witch," he spat. "You think you can just take what's mine?" "You took Emily's life," I said coldly. "You will not take her child, and you will not steal her future." In that moment, something shifted. The surrounding mourners began to take notice of our confrontation. Whispers grew louder. Steve's facade cracked under their scrutiny. "You can't do this," Steve hissed through gritted teeth. "I just did," I replied calmly. "And the police will be involved. You abused Emily and neglected her. Everyone will know the truth." The realization of his crumbling image seemed to hit Steve all at once. He staggered back, while Susan's composure shattered. As George joined me, wrapping his arm protectively around my shoulder, I felt a momentary sense of victory. Emily's voice in my heart gave me strength. This was just the beginning, but it was a powerful step towards justice. My promise to Emily would be fulfilled, no matter what. The day of the public memorial service arrived, and the air was electric with tension. The community gathered, whispers rippling through the crowd. Emily's story had touched many hearts, and people came to pay their respects and show support. Steve and Susan entered, their faces set in defiant masks. I took a deep breath and approached the podium. The murmurs quieted as I began. "Thank you all for coming," I started, my voice strong. "We are here to remember Emily, a daughter, a mother, and a friend. But there's more to her story than what you know." I opened Emily's journal, the pages marked with highlights. "These are Emily's words," I said, "words that tell of her suffering at the hands of her husband, Steve." A collective gasp arose from the audience as I read an entry aloud. Steve got angry again. His words cut deeper than any wound. "I live in fear, not just for myself, but for our child." Steve tried to stand, his face a mix of anger and panic. "This is outrageous, lies. Sit down, Steve," I snapped, my voice resonating with authority. "Let everyone hear what Emily endured." I continued, flipping to another page. "Susan has no sympathy. She belittles me, makes me feel worthless. She enables Steve, and I am trapped in this nightmare." Tears filled many eyes as the weight of Emily's pain settled over the room. George stood by my side, his presence a pillar of strength. "You all knew Emily," I said, holding back my emotions. "You knew her kindness, her love, but few knew the depth of the abuse she suffered. Steve and Susan need to face the consequences of their actions." Gasps of shock and outrage echoed as people began murmuring loudly. The pressure on Steve intensified. A man from the crowd stood. "I'm Emily's neighbor. I heard things. I regret not speaking up. I saw her bruises and her tears." Another voice joined in. "Emily was a good person. She didn't deserve this." Steve's composure finally cracked. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "You have no proof." I met his eyes, my gaze unwavering. "We have Emily's word, Steve, and more will come to light. The police are involved. This community won't stand by and let you get away with this." The crowd's murmurs grew into a unified voice of anger and support for Emily. I turned to the podium once more. "Emily asked for justice, not just for herself, but for her daughter. We won't let her down." Someone from the back yelled, "We stand with you, Linda! Justice for Emily!" Steve's face turned a sickly pale as he realized the tide had turned against him. Susan, visibly shaken, clutched her purse as if it were a lifeline. They both slowly retreated from the crowd, the reality of their impending downfall sinking in. As people came forward to offer their condolences and support, I felt a newfound strength. Emily's voice had been heard. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had endured similar suffering. The public showdown had set the stage for the next battles to come. The police would follow through, and the court would hear Emily's cries for justice. Emily's tragic end would catalyze change, and I would carry on her legacy, fighting for her daughter, her light. The community's outpouring of support at the memorial amplified the tension surrounding Steve and Susan. The weight of their actions bore down, pushing them into public scrutiny. The police followed up swiftly, corroborating Emily's journal entries with neighbors' testimonies. The legal wheels began turning. Court hearings drew closer, and George and I prepared for the battle ahead. The family lawyer, Mr. Harris, was thorough. "We've got enough evidence," he assured us, "but be prepared for a tough fight." The day in court arrived, and the atmosphere was sizzling with unease. I stood with George, holding Emily's journal and photos, my determination renewed. Steve and Susan walked in, flanked by their lawyers, their expressions a mix of defiance and desperation. As the hearing commenced, our lawyer presented the evidence methodically. "Emily Johnson documented her experiences meticulously," Mr. Harris said, gesturing to the journal. "This contains accounts of physical and emotional abuse." Steve's lawyer attempted to undermine Emily's credibility. "These are one-sided entries. There's no corroboration of repeated abuse." But Mr. Harris was prepared. "We have neighbors' testimonies, photos of her injuries, and now this." He signaled to an officer who brought forth a small envelope, a hidden video Emily recorded days before her death. The room held its breath as the video played. Emily's face appeared on screen, her eyes hollow with fear. The conversation between her and Steve was crystal clear. "Steve, stop!" Emily's voice was weak, pleading. "Shut up, Emily," Steve spat back. "You're useless. You're nothing without me. Shocked gasps filled the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Steve. "Is this your idea of a healthy marriage, Mr. Johnson?" Steve's face turned ashen. It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "It is exactly what it looks like," I said, standing up. "My daughter's cries for help were ignored. She lived in fear and pain because of you." The judge silenced the room, turning his focus to me. "Mrs. Waters, your testimony is crucial here. Please continue." Taking a deep breath, I shared Emily's story. Each word dripped with pain and truth. Emily wanted a safe home for her daughter. Steve's abuse made that impossible. Steve's lawyer objected, but the evidence outweighed his arguments. Susan, seeing the tide turn, whispered urgently to Steve, but her words fell on deaf ears. As the day drew to a close, the judge addressed the court. "Considering the overwhelming evidence, including the video and journal, custody of the child will be granted to Linda and George Waters." He paused, glancing at Steve. "Mr. Johnson, you will face charges of domestic abuse. The law will take its course." A wave of relief washed over me as the gavel came down. Steve's face showed a mix of confusion and fury, but he couldn't escape his fate. The community's support, coupled with the irrefutable evidence, sealed his downfall. Walking out of the courtroom, George squeezed my hand. "You did it, Linda. Emily would be proud." "I just wish she were here to see it," I said, tears welling up. But I knew in my heart our victory was her victory. As Steve and Susan became pariahs, shunned by the very community they had sneered at, we found strength in the collective love and support. Emily's daughter would grow up in the warmth of our family, safe from the shadows of her father's cruelty. Moving forward, we had Emily's spirit guiding us. The battle was hard-fought, but justice prevailed. Emily's light shone through her daughter and in every heart that stood up for her. The fire of grief had turned to a healing force, pushing us beyond the pain and towards a future Emily would have wanted. The aftermath of the court's decision brought swift consequences for Steve and Susan. The community that once turned a blind eye now whispered about their downfall. Steve lost his job, and Susan was iced out by her friends, their true natures exposed to everyone. George and I focused on providing a loving home for Emily's child. The adjustment was challenging. A newborn required relentless attention, but in her, we found a part of Emily still alive. Her bright eyes and soft coos reminded us daily of the fight we had endured. One evening, as we cradled the baby in our living room, George looked at me, his eyes full of determination. "We did it, Linda. We kept our promise to Emily." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "We did, but it won't bring her back." "No, but raising her daughter well will be the best way to honor her memory," George said softly, kissing the baby's forehead. A knock at the door interrupted our quiet moment. It was Mr. Harris, holding a thick envelope. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it to me. Inside was the court's final ruling and a letter from the detective assigned to Emily's case. They had found more evidence linking Steve to financial exploitation and physical abuse. Steve and Susan were now facing even more severe charges, ensuring they would be out of our lives for good. "I wanted justice," I said, reading the letter. "And we got it." Mr. Harris nodded. "It's not the end, but it's a beginning for healing." The community's support never wavered. Friends and neighbors brought food, offered to babysit, and shared stories of Emily, helping to keep her memory alive. I found solace in their kindness, which countered the darkness Steve and Susan had cast over Emily's life. One sunny afternoon, as George and I strolled through the park with the baby, a woman approached us. "Linda, George," she began, her eyes soft with understanding. "I just wanted to say how brave you both are." "Thank you," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. "Emily would be so proud," she added, gently touching the baby's hand. As she walked away, I felt lighter. Emily's spirit was with us, guiding every step we took. The baby giggled, a sound so pure that it seemed to chase away the lingering shadows of our past struggles. We continued our walk, the sun warming us. "What do you think about naming her?" George asked suddenly. "It feels like it's time." I looked at the baby, thinking of Emily and her strength. "How about Emma?" I suggested. "It's close to Emily and feels right." George smiled. "Emma it is." As we called out her name for the first time, Emma looked up at us, her eyes wide and curious. In that moment, I knew we were on the right path. Emily's legacy would live on, not just in the fight for justice, but in the love we poured into Emma's life. Returning home, I felt a sense of peace. Our family, though broken and rebuilt, was strong. Emily's bravery had set the foundation for a future where Emma would grow up surrounded by love, protected from the cruelty that had claimed her mother. As I rocked Emma to sleep that night, I whispered, "You are safe now. We love you, and we will always protect you." It was a promise not just to Emma but to Emily as well, a promise we intended to keep. The fire that once burned with grief had transformed into a beacon of hope, lighting the way for us to move forward and ensure Emily's spirit thrived through Emma. I should have known something was off the moment I stepped into the house. An eerie silence hung in the air, a stark contrast to the usual bickering between my husband Connor and his son Alex. Instinctively, I moved closer to the study, the voices becoming clearer with each step. "It's the perfect solution. She'll never suspect a thing." Connor's muffled tone resonated, laced with an unsettling smugness. My heart raced as I pressed my ear against the door, Alex's voice joining the sinister exchange. "You're certain this poison will work gradually? I don't want her dying too quickly before we can access those assets." I gasped, clapping a hand over my mouth to muffle the sound. My mind whirled, struggling to process the unthinkable words they had uttered, a heinous plot against my very life. The doorknob twisted and I scrambled away, my breath catching in my throat as Connor emerged. His eyes narrowed slightly at my presence before a sickening smile stretched across his lips. "There you are, dear. Alex and I were just discussing some business matters." Lies dripped from his forked tongue like venom as Alex slinked out behind him, his reptilian gaze sizing me up like a prize to be claimed. "Is everything all right?" Connor asked with feigned concern, placing a clammy hand on my shoulder. "You look a tad pale." I swallowed hard, mustering every ounce of composure to disguise the maelstrom of emotions raging within me. Fear, anger, disbelief, they swirled together in a toxic concoction, threatening to spill over with the slightest provocation. "I'm fine," I lied through gritted teeth, offering a tight-lipped smile that concealed the churning turmoil. "Just feeling a bit lightheaded, that's all." Connor's brow furrowed with mock worry as he ushered me towards the kitchen. "Why don't you sit down and have some water? I'll whip up something for you to eat." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as his words took on an insidious new meaning. Was this the beginning of their twisted scheme? Would they truly stoop so low as to poison me, their own family, for financial gain? I watched in tense silence as Connor busied himself at the counter, his movements almost mocking in their nonchalance. A glance towards Alex revealed his eyes fixated on me, a sinister glint dancing within their depths like a predator eyeing its defenseless prey. In that moment, a fire ignited within me, a fierce, uncompromising blaze that would not be extinguished. I would not be the victim in this twisted tale. I would be the architect of their undoing. Gripping the glass of water, I met Connor's gaze with an unwavering stare as he approached. A silent challenge burned in my eyes, one he seemed oblivious to in his arrogance. "Drink up, sweetheart," he cooed, that sickening smile never faltering. "You'll be feeling better in no time." As I raised the glass to my lips, a single thought crystallized with resolute clarity. If it was war they wanted, it was war they would get, and I would show no mercy in dismantling their vile scheme piece by wretched piece until justice and retribution were finally served. In the days that followed, I became a silent observer, my ears pricked for any shred of information that could aid my cause. Connor and Alex seemed to carry on as usual, their facade of normalcy only strengthening my resolve. It was Eva, my dearest friend, who provided the first glimmer of hope. Over coffee one afternoon, I finally confided in her about the harrowing conversation I'd overheard, the words tumbling out in a torrent of anger and disbelief. Her eyes widened with horror, but her resolve never wavered. "We need to gather evidence, Lila, build an airtight case against those snakes." I nodded, the first twinges of purpose igniting within me. Eva was right. I couldn't simply confront them without proof. I needed ammunition, and I needed it fast. That evening, I took stock of our finances with renewed scrutiny. Missing funds, suspicious transactions, hidden debts, the trail of deceit woven by Connor and Alex gradually revealed itself bit by bit. "You seem awfully focused on those statements," Connor remarked over dinner, his tone laced with artificial nonchalance. "Anything interesting?" I met his gaze levelly, unwilling to betray the hatred simmering beneath the surface. Just doing a little financial housekeeping. His brows rose in mock surprise before he shrugged, returning his attention to the meal before him, the very picture of apathy towards my growing suspicion. In the ensuing weeks, I became a master of deception, feigning illness while meticulously cataloging every illicit transaction, every underhanded move made by those snakes. All the while, I leaned on Eva, her steadfast support and strategic counsel proving invaluable. "We're getting closer," she assured me one evening as we pored over the mounting evidence. "Soon, we'll have everything we need to bring them down." Connor's smug indifference only added fuel to the fire burning within me. Did he truly believe I was some wilting flower, too feeble and foolish to unravel his tangled web of lies? He was gravely mistaken. It was Alex, however, whose malice truly sent tendrils of ice through my veins. I witnessed firsthand the contemptuous glares he aimed my way, the undisguised loathing simmering in those cold, dead eyes. "Better watch your back," he muttered under his breath as he brushed past me in the hallway one day. "Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen." The pointed remark was a harsh reminder of the venom coursing through their veins, a poisonous hatred that threatened to consume us all if left unchecked. But I was no fragile victim to be cowed by such thinly veiled threats. I was a woman reborn, fueled by a thirst for justice too long denied. With Eva's help, I would tear down the facade of lies they'd so carefully constructed, exposing the rot that festered at their very core. One by one, I would dismantle their lives, just as they had aimed to destroy mine. It was only a matter of time before the depraved depths of their betrayal came to light. And when that day arrived, I would be waiting, not with fear, but with the cold, hard promise of retribution. With each passing day, I immersed myself deeper into the role fate had cruelly thrust upon me, that of the overlooked, ailing wife. It became a twisted charade, one that allowed me to secretly advance my plans while flying completely under Connor and Alex's radar. "You're looking particularly pale this morning," Connor observed over breakfast one morning, his tone a perverse blend of faux concern and undisguised indifference. I offered a weak smile, feigning a weariness that would soon become my reluctant ally. "Just feeling a bit drained lately." His gaze drifted back to his plate with a dismissive shrug. "Well, you'd better rest up. We've got the Benson event this weekend, and I can't have you embarrassing me in front of potential clients." The words oozed with thinly veiled condescension, but I bit back the torrent of rage bubbling within me. Antagonizing him would only undermine the delicate fiction I was so carefully crafting. In the days that followed, I allowed myself to grow increasingly lethargic, my movements slowing to a sluggish crawl that couldn't be mistaken for anything other than infirmity. "Christ, you look like death warmed over," Alex sneered as I shuffled into the living room, sinking onto the couch with a weary sigh. Mustering what little energy I could, I leveled him with a pointed glare. "It must be that stomach virus going around." His expression morphed into one of poorly concealed disdain before he rose from his chair, muttering a parting remark too vile to repeat as he stalked away. With him gone, I allowed the mask to slip, my lips curling into a grim smile. If only he knew the true purpose behind my increasingly haggard appearance, to lull him and his loathsome father into a false sense of complacency. As the weeks ticked by, I turned my attention to securing my assets, meticulously siphoning funds and making arrangements through Eva's trusted network of contacts. A new identity, complete with fresh credentials and a pristine record, would be my safety net when the time came to escape this waking nightmare. "You've got to hang in there," Eva murmured to me during one of our clandestine meetings, her eyes shining with a combination of worry and fierce determination. "We're almost there." I nodded weakly, allowing my body to slump in a semblance of debilitating frailty. "Don't worry about me. Just make sure everything is in place for when the time comes." Her jaw tightened, and she gave a curt nod before rising to leave, the weight of our shared mission heavy between us. With each rattling cough, each tremor that racked my body, I could see Connor and Alex's contempt growing. Their once cutting remarks had given way to stretches of stony silence, punctuated only by the occasional snide glance in my direction. Did they sense the game afoot, Or were they simply biding their time, eager to shed the burden of my existence so they could slither away with my hard-earned wealth? The thought was like gasoline on the flames of my hatred, stoking the inferno that would ultimately consume them. Finally, the night before the pivotal Benson event arrived, heralding the next phase of my intricately woven plan. "Well, you certainly don't look fit to attend tomorrow's function," the Connor remarked with an air of poorly disguised annoyance as I took my place at the dinner table. "Maybe it's best you sit this one out, dear. Wouldn't want you to keel over in front of everyone." His lips curved into a serpentine smile, dark amusement dancing in his beady eyes. I allowed my gaze to drift away, feigning a weary capitulation that he no doubt interpreted as weakness. Little did he know, it was the calm before the storm. The final moments of peace before I obliterated his pathetic delusions of control. As the first twinges of nausea blossomed within me, I steadied my quivering hands against the table's edge, steeling my resolve for the trials yet to come. They thought they had broken me, body and spirit, but by dawn's first light, the game would be forever changed, and Connor and Alex would soon discover they had succeeded only in awakening a force more powerful than any they could possibly fathom. With my newfound air of frailty firmly in place, it was time to set the next phase of my plan into motion. Connor and Alex may have thought me a helpless invalid, but they were about to discover just how debilitating their own arrogance could be. It started small. The subtle planting of suspicious evidence designed to make it appear as though Connor was engaged in a tawdry affair. A lingering spritz of unfamiliar cologne, a swirl of red lipstick on his shirt collar, furtive glances and whispered phone calls when he thought no one was watching. At first, the sign seemed to go unnoticed by those snakes. But I was patient, allowing the seeds of doubt to germinate until their poisonous tendrils could no longer be ignored. It was Alex who finally confronted his father, his anger boiling over during a heated argument one evening. "Who is she?" he snarled, slamming his fist on the table with a force that made me start. "Don't even try to deny it. I've seen the evidence." Connor's eyes widened in what I could only assume was feigned shock and bewilderment. "What the hell are you going on about, boy?" The lipstick stains, the hushed phone calls. Alex's voice dripped with venom as he leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing to slits of pure venom. "You're cheating on us with some cheap whore, aren't you?" The muscles in Connor's jaw twitched as he absorbed the accusation. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flash of guilt in those cold, dead eyes. But like any master of deception, the expression was gone in an instant, replaced by one of towering indignation. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing?" he roared, slamming his palms on the table with enough force to rattle the plates and cutlery. "I've given you everything, a home, an education, a life of luxury, and this is how you repay me?" As the two men descended into a maelstrom of bitter recriminations, I watched in silence, allowing the rift I had so carefully cultivated to deepen and fester. Like a master chemist, I had introduced the volatile elements and stepped back, observing as the inevitable explosion tore them apart. In the ensuing days, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Connor and Alex regarded one another with unveiled hostility, their interactions reduced to terse exchange loaded with thinly veiled accusations. "Where were you until so late last night?" Alex demanded one morning as we sat down to breakfast, his eyes boring into his father with an intensity that would have incinerated a lesser man. "Out with your whore again?" Connor slammed his coffee mug down with enough force to slosh the steaming liquid over the rim. "Watch your insolent tongue, boy. You know nothing of the sacrifices I've made to provide for this family." As their quarrel escalated, I found myself tuning out their specific grievances, allowing the general din of enmity to wash over me. Like a composer, I had orchestrated this discordant crescendo through the skilled manipulation of evidence, and the results were even more glorious than I could have imagined. With father and son torn asunder by suspicion and betrayal, the stage was set for the next, more explosive act in my carefully choreographed theater of vengeance. While they postured and snarled, consumed by the flames of manufactured enmity, I bided my time, a silent, unassuming specter merely awaiting her moment to strike. That moment was coming soon. All that remained was to goad the snakes into striking the fateful blow that would ultimately spell their demise. And I knew just the provocation to rattle them from their coils of seething resentment. So I watched and I waited for the perfect opportunity. And when it came, I would be ready to deliver the grand performance of a lifetime. With Connor and Alex's relationship crumbling under the weight of suspicion and hatred I had so expertly cultivated, it was time to deliver the final, decisive stroke that would bring their bitter animosity to an explosive head. The opportunity presented itself one evening as we sat down for a painfully tense family dinner. The atmosphere was thick with resentment, weighted silences punctuated only by the occasional hostile glare or muttered insult exchanged between father and son. Clearing my throat, I adopted my most frail, wilting demeanor as all eyes turned towards me. "I'm afraid I have some distressing news to share." Connor's eyes narrowed to slits of pure venom. "Out with it, then. Don't keep us in suspense." Feigning a tremulous sigh, I twisted my fingers together in a show of profound unease. "It's about the—" I swallowed hard as if struggling to give voice to some unutterable truth. "The other woman." The words struck like a thunderclap, the air instantly charged with a scorching current of suspicion and fury. Connor shot to his feet, lips peeled back in a wordless snarl of outrage, as Alex leaned forward, eyes glittering with vindicated accusation. "You lying, cheating bastard," the younger man spat, his voice dripping with vitriol. "I knew you had a whore on the side." In one deft motion, I slid a crumpled photograph across the table, one carefully culled from the cache of evidence I had compiled, then artfully staged to capture Connor in a seeming tryst. His brow creased with bewilderment as he snatched it up, only for the expression to contort into one of impotent rage. "This—" He slammed the damning image down with enough force to rattle the tableware. "This is a lie, a twisted, malicious lie." "Is it?" I asked softly, affecting a wounded, almost pleading tone. "Because it would certainly explain your recent indiscretions. The phone calls, the late nights, that strange perfume I've been smelling." Alex was on his feet now, hands balled into white-knuckled fists as he advanced on his father like a coiled serpent. "You smug, self-righteous prick. You've been cheating on us this whole time, haven't you? Carrying on with some two-bit tramp while stringing us along with your lies." It happened in a blur. A flash of movement coupled with an inarticulate bellow of fury as Connor launched himself at his son. The two men collapsed in a tangle of flailing limbs, grunts and curses rent the air as they grappled across the hardwood floor like battling behemoths. I watched, unmoving, as the maelstrom of violence unfolded before me. Let them rend and tear at each other, consumed by the all-devouring flames of hatred I had so carefully stoked within their blackened souls. It was only fitting that I allow them to deliver the fatal wounds that would ultimately seal their demise. At last, Connor managed to pin his son in a chokehold, his teeth bared in a revolting rictus of animalistic fury as Alex's face purpled beneath the onslaught. Revulsion warred with triumph as I observed the spectacle, the gruesome drama playing out exactly as I had orchestrated. Only when it seemed the younger man's eyes would bulge from their sockets did I finally act, fumbling for my phone to hit the record button. Let them have their brutal rematch, their primal showdown of rage and savagery. I would simply sit back and document their sordid performance for posterity. When the dust settled and the violence had finally abated, two battered, heaving combatants glared at each other across the ravaged battlefield of the dining room. Chests rising and falling in ragged desperation, they seemed to realize the depravity of the spectacle they had just enacted. A fractured chuckle, raw and bitter, escaped my lips as I pocketed my phone, the deed accomplished. "Well," I said, my voice steady, despite the turmoil whirling within me like a cyclone of long-suppressed fury. "I'd say the two of you have given me plenty of reasons to revise my will, haven't you?" As their eyes met mine, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty creep across their brutish features. Let them wonder, I thought with grim satisfaction. The game was truly afoot, and there would be no winners, only survivors. In the aftermath of Connor and Alex's explosive clash, a pall of uneasy silence hung over the house like a suffocating shroud. The two snakes seemed chastened in the wake of their primal outburst, slinking through the halls with furtive unease as I remained a specter on the periphery, watching, waiting. It was time to deliver the next punishing volley in my intricately orchestrated downfall. With Eva's assistance, I had already put the necessary pieces in motion to bring this whole sordid affair to its inevitable, karmic conclusion. The first salvo came in the form of an urgent summons from Dr. Harris, our longtime family physician. I arrived at his office feigning a mask of profound frailty, clutching Eva's arm for support as I shuffled inside like a woman treading the precipice of oblivion. "Ah, Lila," the doctor murmured, rising to greet me with solicitous concern etched into his weathered features. "I'm afraid the test results aren't good." My eyes widened with a pantomime of innocent alarm. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" Dr. Harris shook his head, expression grave. "It would appear your condition is more advanced than we initially feared. I'm so very sorry, my dear." The words hung in the air like a stifling miasma weighted with unspoken implications too terrible to fully grasp. Beside me, Eva sagged against my shoulder, overcome with exaggerated emotion as I struggled to maintain my composure. It was all an intricate fiction, of course, a carefully constructed narrative designed to lure Connor and Alex into a state of utterly disarming vulnerability before delivering the coup de grace. Still, I could not resist a flicker of dark satisfaction at the evident torment contorting the doctor's features. Let him marinate in the guilt and misery for now. Soon enough he would learn I had merely engaged him as an unwitting actor in my grand theater of retribution. When Connor and Alex were finally summoned to the office under the pretense of being briefed on my condition, their reactions were a study in callous indifference. While Eva openly wept beside me, their faces remained chiseled masks of stony impassivity, utterly devoid of anything resembling human compassion or empathy. "Well?" Connor prompted, his tone brusque and impatient as he leveled Dr. Harris with an expectant stare. "What's the prognosis, Doc?" "Out with it." The doctor sighed, rubbing his temples in a show of soul-deep weariness. "I'm afraid the situation is quite dire. The tests indicate that Lila's condition is terminal and progressing far more rapidly than we could have anticipated." A weighted pause lingered in the air as I observed Connor and Alex through shuttered lashes, desperate to drink in their reactions. To my dismay, however, they remained as unreadable and impassive as carved granite monoliths, their expressions utterly inscrutable. Until, that is, the moment I spoke the words that would ultimately shatter their smug facades of indifference. "Given the circumstances," I said, my voice a tremulous whisper that still managed to command the room's attention, "I've decided to amend my will, effective immediately." Connor's head whipped towards me, eyes narrowing to serpentine slits of pure avarice. "Oh, and just what changes did you have in mind, dear?" A tremulous exhalation, punctuated by a sickly, bone-rattling cough that doubled me over, draining what little color remained from my ashen features. When I finally straightened, clutching Eva's arm for support, a muscle twitched in the hinge of Connor's jaw, the barest flickering betrayal of the disquiet roiling within him. "My entire estate," my gaze drifted across them with pointed finality, "is to be awarded to the Wilkinson Charitable Foundation upon my death." The silence that followed was deafening, cavernous, charged with a tension so palpable it seemed to suck the very air from the room. I watched in morbid fascination as the blood drained from Connor and Alex's faces, their complexions taking on the sickly pallor of profound shock. For years they had viewed me as nothing more than a means to an end, a gilded path to wealth and prosperity that could be exploited at their leisure. Now, with the rug so violently swept from beneath their feet, they found themselves disoriented, unmoored, vulnerable, in a way they never could have anticipated. The perfect prelude for my ultimate masterstroke, I mused, savoring their stunned disarray. Just a few more deft maneuvers, and this whole sordid theater would reach its thrilling, cataclysmic climax. In the aftermath of my bombshell revelation regarding the amended will, the atmosphere in our home congealed into a noxious fog of barely contained resentment and desperation. Connor and Alex slunk about the house like feral animals caught in a snare, their movements increasingly erratic and furtive as the days passed. I observed their escalating mania from afar, a silent specter bearing witness as the full weight of their impending loss took root in their blackened psyches. The abuse I had endured, the wounds they had inflicted, All could now be glimpsed in the naked despair marring their once smug countenances. At times, their fear and uncertainty would erupt in volcanic paroxysms of unbridled rage, hostile silences shattered by bellowed accusations and furniture-rattling tantrums. When the storms passed, they would inevitably retreat to their respective corners, no doubt scheming new ways to claw back some semblance of control. "You deceitful harpy," Connor raged one morning, slamming his fist on the kitchen counter with enough force to make the plates clatter. "This is your revenge, isn't it? Finally showing your true colors." I met his venom with an impassive stare, my pallid features betraying no reaction as he stalked around the island towards me. Up close, the desperation clinging to his scent was suffocating, underpinned by the sourness of stale whiskey and bitter perspiration. Without a word, I turned and shuffled from the room, every ounce of effort channeled into maintaining my aura of haggard frailty. Let him rage and bluster all he liked. I was beyond the reach of his pitiful intimidation tactics. As my supposed condition appeared to deteriorate further in the ensuing days, Connor and Alex grew only more monstrous in their behavior. Objects were hurled, obscenities screamed with unrestrained virulence. Through it all, Eva remained my steadfast ally, her comforting presence and wise counsel serving as an invaluable bulwark against the maelstrom of toxicity swirling around us. "Stay the course," she murmured one evening as we huddled in the guest room, the muffled shouts of yet another father-son altercation raging beyond the door. "They're coming undone, Lila. You can see it in their eyes." I could indeed, and the realization flooded me with a perverse sort of gratification. For all their feigned indifference and callous disdain, they were merely rapacious vermin scurrying after the crumbs of my hard-earned fortune. Now that the prize had been snatched from their grasping claws, their true wretched natures were being laid bare. It seemed Connor and Alex would stop at nothing to reclaim their coveted windfall, no path too depraved or unethical to traverse. I lost track of the shady associates who began slinking through our doorway at all hours, the heated exchanges punctuated by furtive glances in my direction. At the heart of their desperate scheming, I could see the festering seed of avarice warring with something even more primal, an insatiable, animalistic hunger to reassert their dominance through whatever twisted means necessary. On more than one occasion, I returned from a trip out with Eva to find evidence that they had been rummaging through my affairs, desperation overriding any semblance of discretion. Documents disturbed, jewelry cases left ajar like gaping maws, every inch of my private space violated in their frantic search. Did they truly believe they could find some hidden loophole to circumvent the terms of my will? Or had their madness progressed to such a degree that they would stoop to pillaging my possessions to sate their thirst in the interim? Either way, I recognized their self-destructive flailings for what they truly were: the death rattles of condemned men who simply refused to accept their well-deserved fate. And with every feeble grasping at straws, they only bound themselves tighter in the inescapable noose of karma's brutal recompense. Soon, their options would be well and truly exhausted. Soon, they would have nowhere left to turn, no more depraved avenues left to pursue in their desperate bid for salvation. When that moment of utter defeat and hopelessness dawned, I would be waiting, a merciless specter poised to deliver the death blow that would finally, irrevocably shatter their distorted delusions of entitlement. For now, though, I was content to sit in patient judgment as their world crumbled around them, fueled by the cold certainty that the most exquisite reckonings are often wrought through the unhurried machinations of fate itself. The day of reckoning arrived not with the earth-shattering cataclysm I had halfway anticipated, but with an almost anticlimactic banality. One moment, Connor and Alex seethed before me like two rabid dogs straining at their leashes, their vitriolic threats and obscenities dripping with malice. The next, the door behind me swung open to admit a stern-faced cavalcade of law enforcement officers bristling with grim purpose. "Connor Grayson? Alexander Grayson?" The gruff bark sliced through the volatile miasma like a blade. "You're both under arrest." For a suspended moment, a breath of stunned silence bloomed amidst the chaos. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, pandemonium erupted anew. "This is preposterous." Connor's voice, always so polished and controlled, warped into a guttural rasp of disbelief. On what grounds? Fraud, extortion, attempted murder. The lead detective met my gaze over the pair's shoulders, a silent look of acknowledgement passing between us. I'm sure the charges will become more extensive as the evidence gets processed. As the harsh realities crystallized in the air with each damning accusation, Connor and Alex seemed to shrink in on themselves. The bluster evaporated, the towering swagger diminished, until they resembled nothing more than a pair of petulant, ill-mannered children caught with their hands in the proverbial cookie jar. "You," Alex hissed, feral eyes swiveling in my direction as he struggled against the restraints being secured around his wrists. "This is your doing, you vindictive bye." The slurring profanity was abruptly swallowed as he was wrenched back, a meaty forearm clamping across his throat to stifle the torrent of vitriol. I watched in silence, unmoved, as father and son were forcibly subdued and frog-marched out of my home in a humiliating tangle of flailing limbs. Their baleful glares scorched my unruffled facade like twin blowtorches of pure, undistilled hatred. But I felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no pity. Only a profound sense of closure, of karmic release, as the toxic presences that had tainted my existence for far too long were finally purged from the premises. When the turmoil of their forced exodus had subsided, Eva emerged from the shadows to rest a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Layla," she murmured, squeezing gently. "You're free of them at last." I nodded, the words hardly registering as the weight of what had transpired finally settled over me in a cascading rush. It was done. The nightmare had been excised. The scales of justice finally balanced through the most deliciously poetic of resolutions. And in the wake of that exquisitely calibrated release, I felt nothing. No soaring elation, no swell of vindicated triumph. Just a yawning, cavernous absence where their malignant influence had once reigned. As the authorities conducted their thorough search, meticulously documenting the mountain of evidence I had so carefully curated over the past weeks and months, the harsh realities of Connor and Alex's crimes were laid bare in exacting detail. From the insidious financial improprieties and fraud all the way through to the most heinous deception of all, their despicable plot to poison me and abscond with my estate. With every passing revelation, I felt a subtle sense of lightness pervade my being, a lifting of the oppressive burdens and torments I had shouldered for far too long. By the time the investigators had finished exhaling their findings and departed with stifling courtroom formalities, I felt utterly untethered, buoyed aloft by an ethereal sense of liberation. Only one matter remained unresolved. When Dr. Harris arrived at the house much later that evening, his features were etched into a mask of harrowed apprehension. In his eyes, I witnessed the gnawing dread of a man ensnared in circumstances far beyond his control, the realization that he had been an unwitting pawn in the grandest of deceptions. His voice cracked under the weight of his turmoil before he drew a steadying breath. "I don't know what to say, Leela, when they told me the truth." Raising a hand, I waved away his concerns with an airy gesture of dismissal. "Think nothing of it, Samuel. You were a means to an end, one I deeply regret having to exploit, but a necessity nonetheless." The doctor's throat bobbed as he absorbed my words, the tension seeming to bleed from his frame with each passing second. "Then it's true?" he asked at last, a glimmer of lucidity piercing the fog of trepidation clouding his gaze. "This was all just an elaborate ruse? A scheme to expose them and their misdeeds?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I rose from my seat, suddenly revitalized and suffused with a renewed sense of purpose and vitality. "A woman's got to protect herself, Samuel. Surely you can understand that." And with those parting words, I swept from the room, shedding the cocoon of frailty and deception to greet the next chapter of my existence, one brilliantly unencumbered and replete with the heady promise of reinvention. After all, I mused as I gazed out over the sun-dappled expanse of my perfectly manicured estate, a new dawn was breaking, and I would be damned if I didn't greet it with open arms, finally unfurled from the shackles of a past I never should have endured.